my pleasure to introduce my colleague from the University of Vermont, Professor Asim Zia. He's a professor in both the Community Development and Applied Economics as well as the Computer Science Department at UVM, and is a really giant in our field and an inspiration for us around data science and complex systems modeling. He's also our co-director of the SEGS Lab. He's also the director of the Institute for Environmental Diplomacy and Security at UVM. And he's going to be looking at the factors influencing behavioral intentions in beef producers in specific scenarios. So please welcome Dr. Asim Zia.
Chris, thanks. And really appreciate this opportunity to work on this very exciting project. So far you have heard about from game theoreticians and then from economists. I'm going to bring you to the world of social psychology, because social psychology influences as much the risk perception induced behaviors as economic incentives do. And I'm going to build off of Amy Delgado, who was very nice, who's the director of USDA AFIS, to share her dissertation data that was done with cow-calf producers in Texas, to build a structural equation model of that basically gives us the causal modeling approach to understand the behavioral drivers that influence beef producers' intention to comply with these kind of government regulations as well as voluntary regulations. So some of the key findings from this project is that we think that clear communication of these risk perceptions by the regulatory agencies are very, very important. They can really influence producer attitudes, but also their perceived behavioral control, which is an important variable from social psychological perspective, in terms of their intention to comply with the government regulations. We also find that efforts to increase trust in regulatory agencies is a big causal factor that we found out, that the government can capitalize on building the trust of these farmers and cattle producers to improve the larger resilience in the system. And of course, you know that how much trust is there in the Texas cattle producers for the government agencies. That's definitely changes over time, but there is not much. There's also issues of the positive, like policy interventions that can increase, like the attitudes towards these practices, animal disease control and biosecurity practices, as well as direct technical assistance provided by the USDA to the cattle producers can increase their perceived behavioral control, which in turn can increase the biosecurity compliance. So these are our three major findings, and I'll explain like how we got to this here. So just as a matter of like from definitional perspective, we have to understand the difference between voluntary compliance and regulatory compliance. Voluntary compliance typically alludes to voluntary consulting with the vet when potential epidemic systems are observed. So that is a voluntary behavioral kind of behavior that cattle producers manifest in these kind of situations. Regulatory compliance is like refers to these kind of like stop movement orders, also known as holding cattle, when agencies find evidence of an epidemic disease. But you can understand like there is a split incentive problem here, that when you ask people or these cattle producers to hold the cattle, because of the dynamic nature of the system, it's not always in their interest to hold the cattle because they're aging. So there is a lot of compliance issues with respect to the regulatory, this particular aspect. And this can blow out, especially when the epidemic is happening, and you ask people to do that, and if they don't do it, even a small violation can lead to large nonlinear effects that Chris talked about earlier on in terms of the system dynamics. So this project this is a paper that is under internal review of USDA AFIS, but we are planning to submit to risk analysis. If anybody wants a copy, I can share it with you. Please feel free to email me. So the question is like, what are the key social psychological determinants of compliance behavior of cattle producers regarding, especially with respect to voluntary and regulatory risk management behaviors? Okay, so how did we go about there? Just a brief introduction to theory of planned behavior, which has been applied in modeling risk behaviors of thousands of different decision-making contexts, ranging from adoption of climate change-related behaviors to renewable energy to adoption of other kinds of best management practices. In this particular case, we're talking about behaviors with respect to regulatory compliance and voluntary compliance behaviors. But essentially, theory postulates that there are a lot of these individual, social, and information background factors that shape our behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs, which in turn influence the attitudes, perceived norms, and perceived behavioral control, which influences the intention to adopt that behavior, and then both the actual control as well as determinants of these factors influence the actual behaviors. So even though you might have intention, that does not always lead to adoption of that behavior, but that's modulated by the actual control in that situation. And all of those variables are dynamic, they change over time, and they are also situational and specific to the context that we are talking about. This theory has been applied and also used in simulation modeling as well. So one of the reasons we were interested in doing this was to compare our game theoretical findings with social psych findings in the larger biosecurity context. Okay, so our key hypotheses are that the standard theory of planned behavior, as I showed you in the previous diagram, especially attitude towards the behavior, perceived behavioral control, and social norms have a significant positive effect in explaining the intent to comply with these practices in both voluntary and regulatory compliance behaviors. But we also postulated, based on a focus groups that Amy Delgado conducted with the cattle producers and other regulatory agents, that led to this idea that in addition to standard theory of planned behavior, risk perceptions about biosecurity risk, perceptions about other producers' behavior, trust of regulatory agencies, and moral norms about the behavior have significant effects in producer behavior. So structural equation modeling, we can use that to test these kind of hypotheses, and it's very widely practiced in social science as a modeling approach for building these causal models out of the data that is collected. So this was the model that came out of the focus groups that was published in Delgado et al. 2012 paper, where basically the point that I want to make is that these are the behaviors, the intentional behaviors in terms of voluntary compliance, but similar thing applies to the regulatory compliance. And the focus group, they basically hypothesized that all of these additional variables have a direct effect on them. What we find is that we tested for the direct effect. What we find is that these additional variables that were hypothesized in the focus group have an effect on the behavior, but they are modulated, they're mediated through the standard theory of planned behaviors. The models did not converge when we tested for the direct effects of these latent variables. Rather, they only converged when, and we were able to estimate the models that I'm going to share with you, when these additional variables such as trust are mediated through, for example, moral norms. Here, this one. And I also want to point out that the survey instrument that she implemented on these cattle producers had a lot of these questions which came out of that focus group. For example, in the trust, like how much you trust the regulatory agencies, also similarly moral norms. So these are like all individualized item survey questions that are asked, which we use as an input in estimating these models, especially the latent variables that are estimated through structural equation models. So the survey instrument was distributed in 2013 or so, and we built off of these to test these hypotheses. Especially this survey was, there were 2 mail-out surveys were submitted, and one of them was presented a scenario where an outbreak of foot-mouth disease has already occurred, and the other case, it was not yet occurred, but there were some signs were detected. And that led to these differentiations in voluntary compliance and regulatory compliance. In the first scenario, there were about 524 sample size, 27% response rate. In the second one, there were about 29% response rate. So just to sum up, like how we estimated these structural equation models, there is a scenario of no FMD break, which was listed like this, and a scenario of like an FMD outbreak has occurred. So those scenarios were presented to the cattle cow producers. They responded to these questions, and then they were asked like whether they would voluntarily comply, like whether they would request a vet examination under both of these scenarios, and whether they would hold the cattle under both of these scenarios. So we basically estimated 6 structural equation models. Scenario 1, no FMD outbreak. Scenario 2, FMD outbreak has occurred. So these are structural equation model number 1 and 2. And then we combine them, the data, for structural equation model number 3. Similarly, we do it for the compliance behavior. So we have 6 SEMs in the paper. I'm just going to, because of the interest of time, just present combined SEMs for SEM number 3 and SEM number 6. If you're interested in looking at findings from the other, there are some distinctions and differentiations, but I'll just focus on these 2 combined models. So this is how the structural equation model looks like. These are, just let me walk you through this. So the intention for behavior 1, this is the voluntary compliance behavior. And these ovals are the latent variables that are estimated by the structural equation model. And these are all these are the survey questions that were asked. So for example, in the trust, we asked them, these questions were asked in the original survey to the respondents, like, how much do you trust the regulatory agencies? How much do you trust the other people in yours? So there were a lot of trust questions. And in the structural equation models, it simultaneously estimates the entire model, but also gives us these standardized causal effects that range between plus 100% to minus 100%. So those are standardized effects, and if they're significant, they are shown by the 99% significance is shown by Z3 stars. And so you can basically isolate the magnitude of that effect by looking at these. We've scaled them in this diagram by the coefficient size. So if it's smaller in width, then this would look like this, between 0% and 20%. And if it's bigger, it would like this. Bigger the scale, the more important that is in explaining the causal factors. And what we find here, our key findings are that we were really interested in like how the risk perception percolates through this. And also understanding like the relative effects of attitudes, behavioral control, and social norms in explaining this behavioral patterns. What we find is that attitude exerts a direct and total positive effect, which was expected from the theoretical perspective, but it has attitude as a more strong effect in magnitude compared to the social norms and perceived behavioral controls. But all of the 3 variables are significant as predicted by the theory, as well as tested in many, many other domains. So there is no surprise there. It was like just confirmation of our existing theory. But we also found that all 4 additional latent variables that were postulated in the focus groups have a significant and positive total effect size on increasing compliance, but mediated through the theory of planned behavior variables. So that's an important finding because they do not directly affect the behavior, like trust does not directly affect it. It's modulated from the social norms, and then it has effect. So this is known as the indirect effect. And the structural equation models can calculate both direct, indirect, and total effect sizes. So in the paper, we report those differentiated factors, which are like how much significant they are when you kind of look at indirect, direct effects, or total effects. Okay. Similarly, in some of the voluntary compliance we found, which was very standard, expected from the theoretical perspective, but for the regulatory compliance, we found some interesting, surprising results. First of all, as expected, we found that the attitude exerts a direct and total positive effect, as well as perceived behavioral control. But social norms were not significant in this regulatory compliance behavior. So that is something to ponder about, that why social norms don't matter. But what we found that the risk perceptions have a significant total effect size of 1.1% decrease in the behavioral intention. That's very, very surprising because if the risk perceptions are higher, that means that they are less likely to comply with the regulatory compliance. That's the holding cattle behavior. So that is something that we can think more about, like why is that the cause? But there are, the complex pathways are there. So for example, risk perception has a positive effect on the attitudes, and it has a positive effect here, but risk perception also has a negative effect on the perceived behavioral control, and then perceived behavioral control has a positive effect there. So it's this negative effect that it ends up being total effect size is negative. So of that. So there are like complex pathways that you have to unentangle, that the risk perceptions in the case of regulatory compliance lead to differential pathways that can have positive and negative effects throughout, but overall is negative effect. I also want to point out that increase in trust in regulatory agencies increases the intention to comply. So that was a very strong effect that we found. Key findings. So standard theory of planned behavior is necessary but not sufficient to explain regulatory and compliance behaviors. Additional latent variables such as risk perceptions, trust in regulatory agencies, moral norms, and producers and perceptions about other producers' behaviors are also needed to be accounted for explaining behavioral choices. And the direct effect of risk perceptions on perceived behavioral control had only a marginally positive effect size for increasing voluntary compliance. So in the case of voluntary compliance, risk perceptions matter in an expected direction, but as I explained, in the case of regulatory compliance, the risk perceptions had a rather complicated effect, which is kind of like mediated through both the attitudes and perceived behavioral control. So the point is that, as I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, that from the policy standpoint, if USDA can improve, like make the efforts to improve the risk communication of these, that can have effect on the risk perceptions. And that can also, if they can also improve through technical assistance, the perceived behavioral control, and as well as if they can improve the trust of these producers about these kind of scenarios and the information that is being communicated to them, I think all of those could have an effect on increasing the biosecurity and the compliance with those kind of behaviors. So thank you very much for this. Listening to this, I look forward to the questions.
I'm Gabriela Buccini from University of Vermont. My question, I'm very intrigued by that indirect effect of trust mediated by social norms. Would you be able to give an example of a social norm that is influenced by trust and then influences the adoption?
Yeah, absolutely. So social norms are like, say, there are certain norms, like say, when you have like regulatory compliance, if there is a norm that if you are given the order to hold the cattle, if the norm is that you would comply with that order, like there is a norm in terms of the practices, that's the social norm. So, but if there is a social norm, you live in a clique or a cluster where the social norm is not to comply with that because you do not want to pay taxes to the government, you do not believe that government has any right to access your information or ask you what to do or what not to do. If that is the norm, then they're not gonna comply. That's what we find.
Tim Selno, University of Central Florida. In risk perception, is it possible that these ranchers or cattle producers are seeing this as if the risk exists and it gets you, it's got you? In other words, it's fatalism. Is that part of what's going on and we need to communicate actions for recovery or, okay.
Yeah, that's exactly in our discussion section of the paper. We are kind of like, that's our hypothesis currently, is that kind of like that loss of control because of their lack of trust and their understanding that, like even if they comply, it's not going to help the larger system. So I think like there is that kind of fatalism that's there probably, but we definitely need to test it in through more surveys and like in different environments. But for this particular setting, I think this is our current understanding is that's what's going on.